Hello everybody, Fran here. This video is part one of two videos on the reign of Mary I. This video and the subsequent one will align with AQA A-Level History at the Unit 1 on the Tudors. This video is going to go over government and foreign policy. So before we explore government and foreign policy under Mary I, I just want to clarify some very basic points about Mary. She is the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and she is also the eldest of Henry VIII's children. Importantly, she is not Mary Queen of Scots. Make sure if you're studying this course you are absolutely clear on the differences between Mary I and Mary Queen of Scots. However, having said that, Mary I is Bloody Mary, so you can make that comparison. And she reigned from 1553 until 1558, which is something you need to learn very quickly because the Tudor exam questions can just give you a date range as opposed to naming monarchs. So make sure you're absolutely clear on that before you go any further. So in terms of government under Mary, you have to remember with all Tudor monarchs, for that fact, and all monarchs more broadly speaking, that when they take over, they don't get a blank slate. They don't get to sort of start from scratch. They inherit a system that existed before them. So in terms of the situation Mary I inherits, England is divided on religious grounds. And it is, especially with hindsight, unlikely that she is going to calm that division down. Secondly, she hasn't been brought up to rule, and the consequence of that is that she doesn't have strong political instincts. Almost all of the Privy Councillors have been implicated in the device, which if you're not familiar with the device, please watch the video on Northumberland. And her real loyal supporters don't have much experience in government, and examples of individuals you could name in an essay include Robert Rochester and Sir Henry Bedingfield. And finally, kind of the end point of the above points is that she has to rely on those who served Edward, and the people who served Edward were ultimately Protestant, whereas she is Catholic, so there's going to be potentially issues there. Now, one thing that you can look at when it comes to Mary's government is the number of councillors she has during her reign, and that number is 50. And especially if you're looking at applying this to exam questions, namely whether there's a mid-Tudor crisis, this is quite an interesting area to look at. Some people would argue that Mary having 50 councillors made her government ineffective. And evidence you can use to support that is the fact that Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain was not discussed formally by the council. And if you use your hindsight to know the consequence of that marriage, it kind of can be used to suggest that 50 councillors isn't an effective form of government. On the reverse side, if you wanted to suggest that having 50 councillors didn't make Mary's government ineffective, you could say that Mary regarded councillor, the title councillor, as an honorary title, and she actually had a smaller working council with experienced figures, and you could name individuals such as Gardiner, Winchester and Paget to support that. So what's interesting here is you've got one topic, 50 councillors, but you can take it in two different directions. You can broaden this out in terms of Mary's government. So Mary never really trusted her councillors. She will lose confidence in individuals such as Paget because he opposed the restoration of the English Church to Rome. And the consequence of this distrust is that she turns to foreign advisors for help, namely her husband Philip II and Simon Renard, who is Charles V's ambassador. So again, that can start linking into essay questions about either the effectiveness of government. You could look at it in relation to a crisis. Is this a crisis? Is it maybe not severe enough to be considered a crisis? So just make sure with this information you are thinking of how you could use it in exam questions. So this slide has various reforms that took place during the reign of Mary I. Now, I'm not going to sit and read through these. You can pause this video at this point and read through them at your own leisure. But what I am going to do is explain how you would use this information in an exam situation. One debate that can appear on exam questions is how effective Mary's government was. And again, remember, if you're studying Unit 1C as part of AQA A-Level History, it would be part of a broader question, i.e. it wouldn't just ask you about Mary alone, it would be likely attached to Edward and then either Henry VIII or Elizabeth. What you could do though, if you was asked a question about the effectiveness of government, is you could divide this information out into positive change and negative change. It'd be quite a basic sort of table. Lots of information would appear on your positive column, your column for positive change. So 6 new ships being built, the 1555 Poor Act, Charters of Incorporation. And on your negative change side, you would have a few examples, such as Mary making one error by remitting Edward's last subsidy, but you're unlikely to have as much evidence as you would for your positive column. So that's one thing you can do. If you're wanting to take your analysis deeper and you really want to give yourself the best chance of getting those high marks, you need to think much more deeply about who is seeing the benefits of these changes. Now, due to Mary's short reign, Mary will not see the benefits of all of these changes on this slide. Instead, it will be Elizabeth who sees the benefits. For example, the 1556 to 8 recoinage plan will be implemented by Elizabeth. The 6 new ships that are built will be useful for Elizabeth when it comes to events such as the Armada. So once you've divided this information into positive change, negative change, you could take it a step further and ask, well, in terms of this list of positive change, who is seeing the benefits of these changes? Is it Mary? Is it Elizabeth? One final thing you might want to keep in mind here. There are multiple examples here of Mary making changes that are, broadly speaking, positive. However, what you don't want to do, especially in written pieces, is make an assumption almost that life in England is very rosy and all these acts are being passed and they're making life in England excellent, because that is not the case. And a good example is the poor relief. Whilst Mary does intervene, while she does pass the Poor Act of 1555, England is still experiencing an influenza epidemic, harvest failures. Times are very tough for English people. So I think something you may just want to keep in mind here is balancing any sort of intervention or any change with what life was like in reality. Did these changes fix everything, or were they just reacting to quite hard times, to be honest? So in terms of where you need to take this slide, look at, for examples of positive and negative change, look at who is seeing the benefits of these changes, and finally just keep in mind the broader picture here. What is life really like? Are these positive changes suggesting that life is brilliant? The answer being not really. Moving on to foreign policy then, we kind of start this key question by looking at Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, because he is Spanish and therefore it does come under the banner of foreign policy as well. Mary is quite anxious to get married in general. She wants a male heir in order to secure a Catholic succession. Remember, the next in line to the throne at this point, and who will actually take over after Mary, is a Protestant Elizabeth I. Given Mary's relative age, she's 37 when she takes over, marriage needs to happen sooner rather than later. This slide kind of explores the two options she had, Edward Courtenay and Philip II of Spain. You'll notice that both of them have advantages, both of them have disadvantages, but ultimately Mary is going to marry Philip II of Spain. In terms of the marriage then, it doesn't take place until July. It essentially kind of ends up being delayed for several months because Philip keeps delaying travelling to England. They first meet on the 23rd of July and the marriage is 2 days later. In terms of the wedding, obviously it went ahead, but the weather's not great. The English court are not very welcoming. It's not kind of, I don't think, many people's vision of a dream wedding. Obviously, questions arise at this point regarding how much power Philip should have. And what happens is there is a Marriage Act that outlines how much power Philip is going to have. Now, that act said that Philip was to be styled as King of England, and all official documents would be dated with both their names, and Parliament could be called under the joint authority of the couple, i.e. Mary and Philip. However, there are limits put on his power. He is only going to have the title of king for Mary's lifetime, so he cannot, if Mary was to die, claim England for himself and say he is going to rule as a sole king of England. He can't do that. England isn't obliged to provide military support for Philip's father, so remember, at this point, Philip's father is the King of Spain, and it'll be kind of during Mary's reign that transition of power goes from Charles to Philip. Philip also cannot act without his wife's consent or appoint foreigners to office in England. So measures are put in place to curb his power and to make sure he doesn't acquire too much power in England. However, this marriage isn't a success. It's a political failure in particular. Mary doesn't get pregnant. She doesn't have the heir she wants. She doesn't have a male heir who's going to be Catholic. England is drawn into dynastic disputes, as we're going to see in a second, and we're going to see a pro-French, anti-Spanish Pope Paul IV in 1555 take over, which again is not great if you, as a Catholic monarch, have married a Spanish king. So there are going to be issues there as well. So overall, putting limits on Philip's power was definitely the right move to make in this situation. However, at a fundamental level, this marriage is a failure. The last thing we need to do then is look at the narrative of foreign policy under Mary. Now, her two aims are to restore England to papal supremacy and to marry Philip of Spain. These are aims that are both achieved. However, what Mary did not expect is that these two aims would come into conflict with each other. So in terms of the narrative of Mary's foreign policy then, in January 1556, Mary's father-in-law Charles abdicates and Philip becomes King of Spain. He's declared King of Spain in Brussels, but Mary will stay in England. Following that, a month later, in February 1556, the French ambassador in England is implicated in a plot against Mary when Sir Henry Dudley, who is the second cousin of Northumberland, attempts to assemble an invasion force in France, and it is a plot more widely known as the Dudley Conspiracy. So again, in terms of looking at kind of success, failure, whether there's a mid-Tudor crisis, that is something you may bring into the mix. Philip returns to England in the March until the July of 1557, so the next year, and he's trying to persuade Mary to support Spain and to renew conflict with France. Mary is in favour of declaring war, but her councillors are much more reserved, much more opposed to this because they know that trade with France will be jeopardised as a consequence. However, despite the councillors' opposition, war will be declared in the June of 1557 after Reginald Pole's nephew Thomas Stafford invaded England and seized Scarborough Castle with French help. And that plan more generally was to depose Mary, so in reaction to that event, Mary declares war. England does see initial victory at the Battle of St Quentin. However, this intervention in France, this war in France, is an absolute disaster. In 1558, the French forces take Calais. Now, this is really important. Calais is England's sole remaining possession on mainland Europe, and whilst Calais is a financial burden, it's more symbolic that she's lost this. The prestige is really damaged as a consequence of losing Calais, losing the last bit of mainland Europe that England has possession of. So whilst when you read that at a first glance it might not seem like the most disastrous thing ever, when you put it into the context of how people viewed Calais in terms of it being the last English possession on mainland Europe, it is quite important that Mary loses that.
Huge thank you to Fran for that really interesting video looking at government and foreign policy and the key aspects of Mary's reign. I have a site memory that was some quite important other stuff that hasn't made it into this video, but as Fran said, there is going to be a second Mary video coming, so make sure you have a look at that one too. I hope you've really enjoyed that. This is part of our series that is looking at the whole of the Tudor period, starting with Henry VII, going through Henry VIII, Edward, Mary and Elizabeth. Now there is a whole host of videos going all the way through that. We're looking to cover the whole of the AQA specification on the Tudors, that's 1C, and ultimately everything you need to know for that will be on here. So if you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, so then as the final videos of this, the future videos of this are added, then you get to know about it, and hopefully we can help you with your studies. Thank you very much for watching, and again a huge thank you to Fran for that video.